Let's combine two of our greatest loves, data and fandom. We joined 5 data scientists for a discussion on what it means to be a researcher in fandom. On the top row, starting from the left, we have Franzeska in a room with wood paneling. Ruby, our moderator, is in the middle wearing big black headphones and glasses. And on the left is Jenna with long blonde hair and a plain blue t-shirt. On the bottom, starting from the left, is Lulu. She has glasses and half of her face is shadowed. On the bottom right is Cecilia in a bright white room with shelves and shelves of books. There's going to be charts and graphs that take up most of the screen. Let's get our data on.
Welcome to Research in Data Science and Fandom. I'm Ruby. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I work with the UW's Human-Centered Data Science Lab.
My name is Jenna. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I'm also a student at the University of Washington in the Human-Centered Data Science Lab.
I am Lulu. I run the Central Lumina Tumblr, and I'm best known for doing the Ao3 Census demographic survey, which took place in 2013, I believe, and also the annual Ao3 Ship Stats list of the biggest tags on Ao3. And I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Franzeska Dickson, also she, her. I used to do OTW stuff early on, though I haven't in a long time. I help run a /con in Los Angeles called Escapade, and I've done some stats work looking at comparing fanfiction.net and Ao3.
So I'm Cecilia Aragon. I'm a professor at the University of Washington and the director of the Human-Centered Data Science Lab.
Awesome.
And I use she, her.
Awesome. We're going to talk about some interesting data science and fandom today.
Pie That'll Kill Ya, the problem with fandom statistics. I keep noticing everyone from YouTubers to fan studies students making assumptions about fanfiction based solely on the archive of our own. This trend disturbs me because I think it's giving a distorted picture of what fic as a whole looks like. There are 3 large fanfic archives on the internet: the archive of our own, fanfiction.net, and Wattpad. By my calculation, they contain over 25 million extant fan works. The next largest fic archives have only a few 100,000 works, and even that is rare, so we probably can make generalizations about fic overall from just these 3. But we can't really do it by looking at any one of them alone. So why do some people only look at Ao3? I think it has to do with the types of metadata available on each site. Ao3 has a very obvious and standardized system of marking pairing genders, tagging specific ships, and so on. If you want to know how much MM is on the site, you need only click on the MM tag. Fanfiction.net, in contrast, primarily marks fics by genre, and its list of genres is rather different from what's commonly tagged on Ao3. While it does have character tagging, users must request that characters be added, and some fandoms don't have any. Pairing tagging is a relatively late addition and is not consistently used. There is no metadata about pairing genders. Wattpad has even less clear metadata. Fanfic is all lumped into one category with no official tags for fandom names, and the whole site is driven by popularity metrics. You cannot easily look at an index of everything posted, and there are no clear numbers showing how big the site is. Ao3 data is easy to get, this other data is more difficult, and so I see a lot of similar Ao3 charts and a lot of people assuming that these other sites are about the same with maybe a little more head. Here are recent Ao3 numbers. For this chart, the FM, Gen, MM, and FF slices represent works where that was the only category listed. Anything with multiple categories, no category, or just multi or other is in the multi and other slice, for reasons you'll see in a minute. Now, many of us try to contextualize the Ao3 numbers, explaining that other sites look different, but humans are visual. A nice pie chart will always stick in our brains better than a textual footnote. So, with that in mind, I decided to try to get comparable shipping data from fanfiction.net and Wattpad to show that context visually. This requires taking a random sample of each site and hand classifying it. We can also use this method to estimate the site's sizes based on how many URLs lead to actual fics. Here are my findings for fanfiction.net and for Wattpad. For these graphs, anything with multiple ship types or that I found impossible to classify is in the multi and other category. This method involves a lot of gray area. How do you classify a fic where a canon couple investigates a mystery together, or where one half of a canon couple fights with their in-laws about their relationship. I think you could make an argument either way depending on the exact style and content of the fic. On Wattpad, where a lot of fic is explicitly about romance between a famous guy and a self-insert, this is easier. On fanfiction.net, where there's more plotty adventure fic, it's difficult to determine the boundary between het and gen. MM and FF, however, tend to be more clearly marked, often with warnings. So, when people are trying to analyze fanfic fandom as a whole, and they're only looking at this, I think they're missing that when you look at Ao3 archives, the big picture probably looks more like this. We can't make accurate assumptions about why Ao3 looks the way it does without understanding that it's unusual, and I think that unusualness goes beyond historical accident. I think the existence of ship categories is actually driving this difference. Look at Audible Escape, which was an audiobook service geared towards romance novels. Browsing choices got as specific as hockey player or fake relationship, and as general as, well, literally every type of queerness lumped into one category. It wasn't set up to search for genders plus tropes. The fake relationship results certainly include MM and FF, but it's a tiny fraction of the whole. A fan of straight stuff can easily scroll past what they don't want. A fan of queer stuff, not so much. This is very typical of bookstores and mainstream media and many fanfiction archives. In most spaces not explicitly geared towards queerness, heterosexuality is very literally the unmarked default. It's unnecessary to label it because it's so pervasive. Media Miner, a mid-size fic archive, has 4 categories for explicit and less explicit MM and FF, but no category at all for straight content. I'd like to invite everyone watching to try their own hand at some fandom research, but also to really think about why data is or isn't readily available, and how our choices of which questions to ask reflect our personal interests and further a narrative about what topics are important. I could just as easily have talked about how Ao3 doesn't have a standardized list of genres, so searching for plotty fic can be tricky. I could have taken fanfiction.net's system and hand-classified a sample of Ao3 works to compare that way. A chart of Harry Potter fic by genre is easy to get on fanfiction.net, but producing a similar Ao3 chart would be tricky. I could do it for kinks, but not so well for bookstore genres. Different priorities lead to different site designs, different user bases, and different stats that we can easily pull. The feature that makes it easy to get Ao3 shipping data is the same feature that lets you filter out het. I have to think that that has an effect on who finds the archive comfortable and intuitive, and who does not.
Hi, my name is Lulu and I am an independent fandom statistics researcher who runs the Tumblr Centrum Lumina, as well as the Ao3 account Center of These Lights. I'm best known for my work on 2 different fandom statistics projects, the Ao3 Ship Stats and the Ao3 Census, and I will be talking about both of them to you quickly today. So the Ao3 Census, to begin with, started as so many things do, with an argument on the internet. I was talking to someone about /fandom and the prevalence of people writing fic, and they brought up the very common claim that everyone who writes fanfic is primarily a heterosexual woman writing about men because they are attracted to them. Now, the problem I had with this was at the time I was someone who wrote /fanfic while not being a heterosexual woman, and so were a lot of my friends, and so I wanted to get a better idea of whether or not this statement was actually true, or whether it was just received wisdom that was far out of date. So I set up a quick survey, expecting to get a few hundred responses. And I woke up the next morning to over 4,000 responses. The survey quickly grew much larger than I'd initially planned, and I wound up getting just over 10,000 responses in total. There are a huge number of graphs and analysis of the results, which you can find on my various social media accounts. But the one that I find most fascinating is this graph. And this shows the sexuality and gender of all of the people who responded to the survey, saying that they were users of Archive of Our Own. As you can see, about 1/3 of the people who responded said that they identified as heterosexual women. And for the purposes of this graph, that includes both trans women and cis women. About another 50% of the respondents were women who identified as some other sexuality, most of them identifying as either bi or pansexual or both. But there were also significant numbers of gay women, asexual women, and women who identified as various other sexualities. The majority of those who remain identified as some form of non-binary gender, with men making up only a couple of percentage points on the graph, only slightly bigger than the people who just didn't respond to the question. So the thing I really want to highlight here is that fandom has always been not only a space focused on women creators, but also a space for LGBT creators, and LGBT people are now the majority of people who read and write fanfic. Moving on, my other project, the Ao3 Ship Stats, is a project where every year I use a web scraper to work out what the 100 most used relationship tags on Ao3 are. So if we look at the overall list at the moment, there will be a lot of familiar names on this list, I'm sure. We have Destiel, Johnlock, Steric, Stucky, Drary. That's our top 5. I'm sure there are many other pairings that you have heard of in the top 100. But you can see that there isn't really a lot of change in the top 100 from year to year. None of the top 5 have moved at all. And there's only 3 or 4 big jumps in the top 25 we can see here. So the reason I do this list annually is more to look at which pairings have gained the most fics from year to year. And so if we look at the 2020 list for the most increased, we can see that top of the list is Aziraphale and Crowley from Good Omens. They had an excellent year. 20,000 fics is the most I have seen since the beginning of this project. Second place goes to a pairing from Modal Zushi and its associated TV series The Untamed. We have Star Wars, and we have new entries from fandoms like The Witcher and 911, as well as major continuing pairings from fandoms like Harry Potter, the MCU, and My Hero Academia. And so this gives us a much clearer idea of what fandom's current priorities are from the last 12 months. Now, if you've been paying attention to the last couple of slides, you will have noticed that I color code all of the pairings by the gender and the race of the people involved to mark whether they are MM, FF, FM, and so forth, and whether they include white people, people of color, or people of ambiguous gender, which is normally animated characters or characters of fantasy races with no real-world counterpart. This allows me to look at what level of representation there is in the top 100 overall. So for the overall list, only about 13% of the people on the list are actually women. It's very male-dominated, while about 26% are people of colour. On the yearly list, it's 11% women, so a similar number there, and actually 46% people of colour on the yearly list. Now those representation numbers for people of colour might surprise you a little, and in fact the number of people of colour on the list has increased hugely in the last couple of years. So I wanted to share with you today a new analysis I've been working on, which will be going up on my social media shortly after this presentation is made public. And this graph is looking at the rate of representation of different races over the course of the last 8 years that I have been working on the Ao3 Ship Stats project. you can see that the rising number of people of color, especially the big increase since about 2017, has been primarily driven by this bright red line at the bottom, which represents Asian characters specifically in Asian pieces of media. So this is primarily anime and manga fandom, and also K-pop fandom, Chinese dramas, and any other kinds of Asian works which are getting popular on AO3. There are a couple of different reasons for this rise. One contributing factor is that AO3 has seen an increasing number of Asian users, especially over the last couple of years. But there's definitely also a case that anime and manga fandoms among Western audiences, which have always existed as part of the fandom community, have gradually been moving from other fanfic platforms onto Archive of Our Own as it grows in popularity. Now, if we look at the graph more generally, we can see that while the number of people of colour overall has been growing hugely thanks to this increase in Asian representation, specifically the number of black characters appearing on the list has actually been steadily decreasing since 2013. And I think it's really important to highlight this, especially in light of the current conversations happening around anti-blackness and colorism and the way that these are reflected in fandom as they are in other parts of our culture. Now, just to finish up, I wanted to bring up another analysis from my comparisons over the course of the Ao3 Ship Stats project. This graph is looking at how the top 10 biggest fandoms from the last 8 years have changed in terms of the total number of fics that they have in the top 100 year to year. So you can see that Supernatural was until very recently the biggest fandom, but it has been overtaken by the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the last couple of years. But the interesting thing to me, I think, is that nearly all of these lines are gradually dropping. The only fandom where we see a significant sustained increase is the Bangtan Boys, who have had a massive growth in popularity over the last few years. And the reason I find this so interesting is because I think it really highlights the fact that once a fandom gets big, it tends to stay big almost through inertia for a long, long time. Big fandoms tend to drop off the list very slowly, while it's much, much harder for a new fandom to grow large enough to join the ranks of these upper echelons. And so I think it's always worth keeping that in mind while we think about what we are giving our attention to now and what we want to give more attention to in the future. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. You can find all of my statistics, as I said, on Centrum Lumina on Tumblr or on Center of These Lights on AO3. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation.
Thank you everybody for listening so far. We are some researchers from the University of Washington, and we're going to be talking about fanfiction and data science. We are all from the UW's Human-Centered Data Science Lab. I'm Ruby Davis. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and I've been with this research team for about 3 years now, and I've been involved in fandom for about 10 years. I work full-time as a design researcher, but I still make time to do some research with this group because I think the work that we do is really important and really interesting.
Hey everyone, my name is Jenna, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington as well, at the Human-Centered Data Science Lab, and I've been working with the Fanfiction Data Science group for 3 years and a little bit of change. Outside of school, I'm also a professional researcher at Adobe. So I lead this double life of research by day and more research by night.
So hi everyone, I'm Cecilia Aragon. My pronouns are she, her. I'm at the University of Washington. So my day job and my research job are the same. I'm the director of the Human-Centered Data Science Lab and a professor in Human-Centered Design and Engineering, the department at the University of Washington. I teach data visualization and data science. I've been leading this group since 2014, together with Katie Davis, who's a professor in the information school at UW. And I started writing fan fiction when I was 10 years old.
Okay, let's get to it. As we mentioned before, we are from the University of Washington's Human-Centered Data Science Lab. Our lab is a lot bigger than just Jenna, Cecilia, and I. Over 15 different researchers have contributed to the research that we're about to share with you, and a few of them are listed here on this slide. We define human-centered data science as a scientific approach to making sense of human-created data at scale, given the limited human capacity to consume all of that data. Basically, there's lots of information out there, and without this approach, we'd never be able to begin understanding what it all means. One of the key focuses of our research group is mentorship and fanfiction. In particular, we study distributed mentoring, which is networked exchanges among writers and their audiences that accumulate to a greater whole of mentorship. On fanfiction.net, this distributed mentorship occurs in reviews or comments. Distributed mentoring can be one-to-one or many-to-one, meaning that many reviewers can leave reviews on one author. In addition, the roles of mentor and mentee are fluid, meaning that you could be mentoring someone on grammar while receiving mentorship on characterization. Distributed mentorship is also asynchronous and persistent communication, meaning that the artifacts of that mentorship, aka the reviews, are preserved on fanfiction.net. And while we're studying distributed mentoring through the lens of fanfiction, it is also worth noting that this kind of mentorship can exist in spaces beyond fanfiction and fandom.
So this project has been going on for 6 years, ever since Katie Davis, a professor at the Information School at the University of Washington, and I met at an informal lunch. And we started to discuss various issues going on and realized that we wanted to start a project to contribute to the growing conversation that fan fiction is not only legitimate, but is important. It's really important in particular for anyone who wants to understand what young people are thinking and dreaming about and where their passions lie and how they might learn. So we started out by conducting an ethnographic study in 2015, where Katie and I and a group of students spent 9 months as participant observers in 3 fan fiction communities and websites. So over the years, we've produced various publications on our work, and all of these are available for free on our website, which is linked at the bottom. We have a metadata set, which is of the metadata on fanfiction.net that's been anonymized with differential privacy to make sure that nobody's privacy is violated. This is a sensitive community, and we want to make sure that people have the right to delete and keep their fanfictions private. Over time, we published multiple other papers that we'll talk about in more detail later here. Essentially, what we discovered, along with verifying the existence of distributed mentoring and how important it is in this community, as well as any networked public, we also found out that distributed mentoring actually predicts how large a vocabulary authors use on fanfiction.net. And in general, we feel that this is a sign that distributed mentoring is showing that learning can be enhanced. Also, another very important piece for us is to study and describe a community that's a safe space for young people and marginalized individuals, a place where adolescents can explore their identities. What we found was that this community provides room for young people to explore transgressive ideas, topics that may not be acceptable in mainstream society. And it's also a place where young creators can make characters that look like them, and that can be central to their shared narratives. And they're doing that rather than following Hollywood-inspired ideas. The heroes are primarily white males, for example. So yeah, we decided to study fanfiction.net, even though it's not the most popular fan fiction site and certainly not the fastest growing site, but because it's really often the first site that young people who are just getting involved in fan fiction start out in. And the demographic of FanfictionNet is, when we studied it, 82% of them are between ages 13 and 18. And half of the authors and readers on fanfiction.net are age 15 or age 16. So the median age is 15 and a half. And that was the demographic we really wanted to study when we were talking about distributed mentoring, because we wanted to see how adolescents were learning from each other when they were in communities that were not structured school environments. We're very interested in informal learning and its power. Fanfiction.net is still the largest repository of fanfiction on the web today. There are nearly 7 million stories that have been published, over 61 billion words of fiction, and over 177 million reviews. Now, it's important to put this in context, because when you say 61 billion words, well, how much is that? It's very hard for us as humans to comprehend a number that large. But if you look at the Google Books published English data set of all fiction that has been written since the printing press was invented, that's 80 billion words. So in other words, in the last 20 years, young people, mostly teenagers, have written 3/4 of the amount of fiction that has been published in all of our history as in the English language. So it's a tremendous outpouring of creativity and something that has been relatively understudied in academia. And although there's been a lot of good work done in fan studies and certainly in informal settings, there's really been tremendous advances in the studying of this community, but academia has lagged behind, I'm afraid. There's good work done, but I think we need much more because of the importance of the topic. So one of the things we do in our lab is we visualize our data, and visualizing data can tell you some surprising things. So if you look at this graph of fan fiction published on fanfiction.net from about 1999 through May of 2016, you notice a few interesting phenomena. The most obvious one is around 2013, the amount of new fiction published on this site started to go down. I wonder if anybody has any theories as to why that's the case. Probably anybody who's been involved in the fan fiction community knows the answer. This is right around the time that Ao3 started to gain more traction as really a better site for fan fiction to be published. And also, this is around the time when the owners of fanfiction.net started just randomly deleting stories that they decided didn't meet their guidelines. So there was a mass exodus to archive of our own. The second really interesting thing you can note from this visualization is, what are the months that people publish the most fan fiction? This speaks very clearly to the demographic of young people, particularly school age, primarily girls, in the Northern Hemisphere. So you'll notice that the months of July and August have the most story starts. And there's also small spikes around December and January. So when school age kids are on vacation, either summer vacation or the December break. And there's one last thing that I would like to mention that I think is important to note, is when we studied the demographics of this site, the exploration of gender nonconformity in fanfiction became very clear. It was interesting to me that there are actually more young authors on fanfiction.net who identify as gender nonconforming than there are who identify as male. The percentages we came up with was 74% identify as female, 11% identify as male, and 13% as gender nonconforming. And I believe that fanfiction in general has been dismissed in part because so many of the authors are young girls or gender nonconforming. And one of the things we hope to do with this work is provide a contrary narrative to that.
So we have a massive data set of billions of words of text. And one of the questions that we want to answer about distributed mentoring is, can we find a statistical link between the number of reviews someone has received and changes in their writing? So we needed to find a good measure to capture some kind of change in writing quality that is widely applicable across tons of different kinds of fan fiction. And the measure that we settled on is called the Measure of Textual Lexical Diversity, or Mtld. And Mtld is a measure that really tracks vocabulary usage more than anything else. And it's very flexible for different lengths of text, and it works very well on prose. And so I have an example of Mtld here. So we have the same sentence, a couple of sentences, and on the left side, I have very large, very uneasy, very fancy. And this kind of represents a lower diversity of vocabulary. And especially we have this repetition of words, the use of very over and over again. And this generates an Mtld score of 50. But when we substitute those for different words, enormous, anxious, lavish, we get an Mtld of 68. And overall, in the fanfiction text data set, we see Mtld ranging from about 50 to 150, with the average being about 100 to 105, somewhere in there. So can we actually link Mtld to interesting measures? So on the left side, we have this chart here of Mtld versus age. So we actually extracted age from tens of thousands of profiles, looking at people saying how old they were in that profile, and then using that age that they stated in their profile to calculate what their age was at various times when they posted chapters. So you can see this trend line. So starting at age 10 or 12, going to age 32, and then we grouped everything that was an age older than 32 together into one data point. And we averaged together all the Mtlds of fan fictions written at these different ages. And you can see this very clear trend line from about 13 to 24, where there's this steep amount of increase in Mtld. So it's a very, very visible change in Mtld score that happens from adolescence to early adulthood. And on the right chart, we have Mtld versus the number of reviews someone has received in total on fanfiction.net. And this is on a log scale. So on the x-axis, we have 0, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, right? And you can see that someone who has received 0 or 1 reviews in total on fanfiction.net writes on average with an Mtld of 94. Whereas once they've received 1,000 reviews on fanfiction.net, on average, their writing will have an Mtld score of 102. But people get older and receive reviews on fanfiction.net at the same time. So can we tease out this, which one is having the effect and how much? And so that's where we get into the statistics. We used an analytic method called a mixed linear regression. And this is essentially a mathematical way of drawing a line through a bunch of data points. And we're able to model in this linear regression the number of days someone has been participating in fanfiction.net. So each day they're getting a day older, right? The number of reviews they've received on fanfiction.net. And then we can also model, introduce a correlate variable for fandom, because we know some fandoms are just going to be more popular than others. So we need to have something to keep track of this in the model. And then we just have this little e, that's the error term in the model. So essentially our model is Mtld equals some days coefficient plus some reviews coefficient plus some fandom factor plus some amount of error, because there's just a lot of variation in lexical diversity in general. And what we found in the statistical analysis essentially amounts to somebody who receives 650 reviews on fanfiction.net writes like they are 1 year older. And that's even when we're accounting for aging. So there is this very significant statistical effect that, that we can tease out of reviews on Mtld scores.
So we just looked at mentorship from a linear regression perspective, where all the relationships were treated the same. So a one-off anonymous review was treated the same as one that was part of a long-standing relationship. But to look at the differences between relationships, we need to take a social network analysis perspective. These visualizations represent reviewer-author distributed mentoring networks. Each dot or circle is an author or reviewer, and they're connected by lines if they've exchanged reviews. What you'll see are a bunch of reviewers that are clustered around authors, because that's sort of just how this network is built. Is an author publishes a story, and then a bunch of reviewers will review that story, and that connects and builds out this network that creates a fandom, basically. From a social network analysis perspective, the left visualization is what a fandom looks like. In order to begin uncovering differences between these various reviewer-author relationships, we decided to see if structures described in prior social network research applied to distributed mentoring networks. One of these models is shown here. In this model, your relationships are organized into circles or layers based on how often you communicate with those people. The innermost layer is smallest and has the fewest people, but you communicate with those people very frequently. Each subsequent layer has more and more people, but you communicate with those people less and less frequently. The outermost layer will be the largest, but you communicate with those people very rarely. This model has been found to accurately describe social networks like Twitter and Facebook, and we found that it also describes fanfiction.net reviewer-author distributed mentoring networks. We analyzed the social networks of about 66,000 active authors. We found 2 to 3 layers in that social network. The closest layer has about between 4 and 11 people, and those people exchange reviews about 6 to 8 times per month. If a given author's network has 3 layers, then the middle layer has about 20 or so individuals, and they exchange reviews about 3 times per month. The outermost layer has anywhere between 50 and even 100 people, and those are including relationships where 1 review is exchanged per month on average. So now that we've created this visualization to see what an author's social circles on fanfiction.net look like, do reviews differ on each of these different layers? We decided to use machine learning to sort the reviews on each layer into categories. We categorized the reviews into update encouragement, which include reviews that might be like, please update soon, or please give me the next chapter, I really want to read it. And then we also categorized reviews into a targeted review category, which are basically any review that specifically calls out some aspect of the story that the reviewer maybe liked or disliked or something. An example of that could be, I love the way that you write this character's voice, or I really like the imagery that you used in this chapter. So we found that these types of categories exist in all different parts of the social network model, but reviewers in closer layers are 5% more likely to be leaving targeted reviews, and reviewers in the outermost layer are 10% more likely to leave update encouragement reviews.
So we've done a lot of statistical analysis, but we want to understand more in depth how people are experiencing mentorship in the fan fiction community, how they seek out mentorship, and so many more questions about how this happens. So the best way to do that is actually just to talk to people. So in January and February 2019, we conducted 29 one-hour interviews with fan fiction authors. And we have a whole series of posts on this in our blog, so definitely go check that out. But in a nutshell, what we heard were really powerful stories of not just receiving feedback and mentorship, but building relationships that have real impact on the lives of fan fiction authors. And even if people are exchanging reviews, what we found is that there's so much more to this than just the review exchange, because that's really a meeting place. People will review each other's fan fictions, but the relationships could cross to all sorts of different platforms like Tumblr, like Discord. People build relationships and those move across different spaces online. We also found that relationship building and writing critique are intertwined because you need to build trust with someone to really be able to receive critique from that person. And we found lots of strategies for how people find feedback and make these connections. So if you're looking to figure out how to best connect with other people and get feedback on your writing, definitely take a look at our blog post because we outline lots of strategies there. We also have lots more projects in progress that I'll spoil the results for you a little bit, but these are upcoming, and we're really excited about this work that's currently ongoing right now. So one question we're looking at is expanding the reviews versus Mtld analysis. So yes, we found that receiving reviews is linked to changes in Mtlds, but what about giving reviews? Because definitely, if you're reading lots of fan fiction, there's a possibility that could make you into a better writer. So we wanted to put a statistical test to that. And we also wanted to look at differences between types of reviews, because some reviews are just really short and sweet, like I loved it. Some of them are, hey, please write more. I want to see the next chapter, right? And some of them target a specific portion of the text and call out the characterization or give specific feedback on that. So we actually have worked on a machine learning classifier to classify reviews as shallow positive, as update encouragement, or as targeted. That's step one. Step two is a more complicated model linking reviews to Mtld. That includes both giving and receiving reviews, and that incorporates these categories that we've written a machine learning algorithm to classify. So spoiler alert, we're finding a correlation between sending reviews on other people's fan fiction, and specifically sending targeted reviews, and changes in Mtld. And we have this chart. This is a very early visualization that was made by one of our group members. And clearly it's not as perfect of a line as the one that I showed you earlier in this presentation. And that's because it's a smaller sample, so it's noisier. But you can definitely see that when someone has sent less than 10 targeted reviews, their Mtld is lower, right? But on the right side of the chart, as they have sent more and more reviews, their Mtld trends higher. So we're starting to find this connection, and we're working on this statistical analysis right now. And another question we want to answer is, do authors actually write more in response to reviews? If you say, hey, please write another chapter, I really need to see this, does that actually work? This is a very important question. So we're actually adopting a model used in medical fields called survival analysis. And oftentimes this is used to look at outcomes for patients in response to receiving different medical treatments. In our statistical analysis, we're treating reviews as a medical treatment and writing chapters of fan fiction as a patient outcome or an event. And what this chart on the left side of the slide here shows is 4 different categories. So the red and green categories, and the blue and purple categories are people who received more reviews. And what you can see is this increasing of writing chapters of fan fiction over time. So pretty much at the 90-day mark, you can tell one or not. The line kind of is pretty flat by then, right? You can kind of tell whether someone is going to write another chapter or not. And you can see that the purple line is going to be higher around that time. So people who do receive more reviews do write more. We're working on the statistical model, but we're finding really significant results already. It's super exciting stuff. So a third ongoing study we have is, all right, we're making all these really cool visualizations of review data. What happens if we show these to authors? Can visualizations of review data actually help to promote reflection and help people to think about the way that they're writing? Because they can see a more direct visualization over time of the response that they're getting from their audience. So we have a blog post on this one too. We're playing around with all sorts of different visualizations, and we're getting ready to test them out on authors to see, are there ways that we can use all of this data to actually directly help people think about the way that they write. And if you're interested in the deeper story of all of this work in our lab, in the Human-Centered Data Science Lab at University of Washington, Cecilia Aragon and Katie Davis, who founded this project, have written a book that really chronicles everything that we found and the story behind all of those findings. So definitely check that book out too.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to our presentation. I hope you learned something new. And if you'd like to contact us, you can use any of the contact information that we shared on the previous slide. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
It's great to have everybody here. We're going to jump into a bit of a Q&A here, where we've taken some questions from our followers and other people we know in fandom to come up with a few discussion questions. I think a good place to start here, we received a question that asked, how do we collect our data for our stats? Would anybody like to start on this one?
I can start. So at the University of Washington Human-Centered Data Science Lab, we've mostly focused in our data collection on fanfiction.net. And the way that we have collected is actually by writing a web scraper. So this is like a bot that automatically goes to pages on the site and actually downloads all of the text, as well as all of the little like fields, flags, everything that's tagged on each particular chapter of fanfiction, and then all of the reviews as well. And then we assemble all of this into a big database. So our fanfiction.net database covers the entire range of the site starting in, I think, 1999 and ending in 2017, and covers something like 64 billion words of fan fiction.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add to that when we did the scraping, we made sure to follow the terms of service of fanfiction.net at the time, and we metered it carefully. And the data is because it's very sensitive, we want to respect the creator's right to delete or orphan their stories. And so we keep it extremely private. When we do any releases, we use differential privacy and other techniques to make sure that anonymity is preserved. And we do not allow access to any of the stories for obvious reasons. We want to protect the privacy of the authors and the reviewers.
So I focused most of my research on Ao3, primarily because it's a bit easier to deal with than fanfic.net. Fanfic.net you really need a scraper, but because of Ao3's tagging system, it's very easy to put in just a tag or combination of tags and find out how many fics people have written for that. So originally when I started, I was literally just doing that by hand for large numbers of tags. Now I have written a web scraper program that does it, but all I am doing is accessing publicly available information about the tags, so I'm not downloading people's fics in this case, just the data about the tag that contains all the fics. Whereas for my demographic stuff, it was literally a Google Forms survey that I just sent out on Tumblr. So I kind of, when I first started the demographics, I really didn't think it would be as popular as it was, and Google Forms was perhaps not the best choice given how popular it got. But it was just as simple as like throwing together a quick survey and sending it out, and then I wound up getting much more response than I expected. And so obviously there are lots of different survey making websites available, so I might use one of those if I do more demographics type statistics in future. But it is, again, something that's very easy to get started on if someone's interested in doing it for themselves.
Yeah, sort of a similar answer for me. I've certainly used some scripts at times, but a lot of what I've done is to try to, say, get some data from fanfiction.net that we can compare to Ao3 and stuff like shipping, and you can use a script to scrape to get your random sample, or you can literally use a random number generator and just turn those into URLs and just open them all and see what they are. But if you're trying to do a lot of what I've been trying to do, you know, it's helpful to scrape the data, but ultimately what you're doing is looking at each fic and saying, okay, how would I classify this fanfiction.net fic according to like an Ao3 classification? And at that point, I mean, it's just kind of like human, I mean, you're doing it yourself. You're like hand classifying things. So there are scripts that make it a little bit faster, but ultimately it is this kind of very clunky, like by hand, looking through everything. Pretty low tech, really tedious, but that's kind of the only way to get certain of the data that people find very interesting.
Yeah, and I do want to say that this is why we're called the human-centered data science lab, right? We use these scripts to deal with these very large data sets, but yes, the human looking at it individually is very important. I mean, it's critical.
I think our discussion here has touched on another question that we have on our list here. What statistical software do people usually use for fandom stats?
I could add a little bit more here. So when I say like what software do I use, because what I do is pretty like low tech and just kind of hand counting things, I actually just use like a Google spreadsheet most of the time to keep track of my data. Obviously there are statistical questions where you might want something more sophisticated, but for a lot of the things a lot of people out there are interested in, you could do it too. You could just use Google spreadsheets like I do. Get yourself a sample of data and analyze it. It's as simple as that for me.
Yeah, and I think people underestimate exactly how much you can do in a Google spreadsheet, because I've done some quite complicated statistics using nothing but Microsoft Excel.
So I feel like I have a more elaborate answer to this, because in our fanfiction data science group, there are 9 people, and not everyone uses the same thing to do their stats or their work. So for me personally, there are some things like in stats that can only be done in the R programming language, because people just only implemented it in that language. So you got to use it. So sometimes I use that for that. And an example of that is a mixed linear regression, which is this time series analysis to look at how do all these different factors like number of reviews someone received, number of people who are following them, how do those impact some outcome? So those kind of really complicated analyses we have to do in R. My sort of preferred statistical tool is Jupyter Notebook in Python. So that's much more flexible and I think easier to get into if you're looking for programming languages to do statistics. And that's kind of what I would recommend to most people. But we also use other software like Tableau to make visualizations. People definitely still do things with spreadsheets just for quicker or kind of like smaller things. So, and it's kind of bring your own tools in our groups. So if you want to use a different tool, you're welcome to do that. No one's going to stop you. And so lots of people using lots of different tools is kind of how it shakes out.
Right. Our group has also written, over the years, we've written a number of tools that we've used. So for example, we have a tool that we call Text Prism, where you can collaboratively assign categories to text reviews, and then we can run machine learning tools on that. And that the tool we have that does that is called Allo. And this is all on our webpage. It's all freely downloadable and in GitHub. If people are more technically inclined, they can visit. If you Google Human-Centered Data Science Lab, you'll come to our webpage where you'll find access to all the GitHubs and all the software and the instructions.
We have another question here, kind of shifting gears a little bit. Why are young women writing so much fiction? Has it always been like this?
Oh man, there's like so much in this question. I think the very short answer is yes, it's always been like this. But the longer answer to me would be, first of all, the question specifies young women. Obviously, different websites have different like average ages, but I think in the context of this particular question, it's not great to have like young women in there because women in general tend to write a lot of the fan fiction out there, and older women and younger women both write I don't think there's anything particular about the fact that they're young. Like, women in their 20s tend to have more free time than women in their 40s, and thus are going to be writing more fanfic or posting more fanfic often. But there's not some special property of youth that leads to like more I don't think. I don't think we have any data that supports that idea. And there's also this kind of subtext here of like, there's so much. I agree that in my mental conception of like the normal default level, when I look at Ao3, there is so much on Ao3. But not only is Ao3 pretty different from Wattpad or fanfiction.net or like the smaller sites out there, but also we have to question like, what's a normal amount?
Yeah, so I've written about this question quite a lot in the past, and the number one thing I want to say is this is not a question that has a single answer. There are thousands, maybe millions of young women out there writing fanfic, and each of them is going to have their own reason for why they do it. And so this urge to kind of come up with one monolithic, this is why, no, forget that. You're never going to get a satisfying answer, and all you will get is lots of arguments back and forth from people who are convinced they know the sole reason why it's that way. But one thing I think is important to keep in mind is, from my demographics survey, and other surveys have shown the same thing, more than half of the women in fandom are LGBT+, and they are not heterosexual. And I think it's a very different phrasing to say, why are young LGBT women writing about gay men, than it is to say, why are young women writing about gay men. Like, there are a lot of complicated things about the intersecting identities there of being a woman, of being LGBT+. like, and of the way you relate to gay males. And that's, you know, that's a whole mess of things that I can and have written about for pages and pages.
I'll break in on that and say, like, if I were asking that question of myself, the question I'd be asking is, why do I, a bisexual woman, like writing about bisexual men as opposed to bisexual women? But I don't write about gay men. I write about bisexual men. And so, like, you know, right there, it's like, of course, the question specified MM. It didn't say what the sexuality is. But often when people ask that question in other contexts, I have seen them saying, why are straight girls writing about gay men? And it's like, that's often not what's happening.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind that, like, it's basically, what if you're asking why is a group that has a lot of oppression on different axes writing about a group which relative to them has some more privileges, like, that brings in a completely different dynamic to, again, the kind of straight girls versus gay men. It kind of turns into the oppression Olympics, like, you know, is being a woman worse than being gay? Fight.
fight. Yeah.
My short answer to this is because there's not enough MM in mainstream media, right? A lot of the reason anyone writes any fan fiction is because they want to correct something that has gone horribly wrong in mainstream media, like the end of Game of Thrones, right? Lots of people rewrote the end of Game of Thrones. Maybe there's just an underrepresentation of MM pairings, and people aren't satisfied with what they're seeing, and they want to do something about it. I think ultimately that's the motivation behind a lot of fan fiction. And so why write MM pairings? Well, because people want to see MM pairings.
I think it's also fair to point out there is a lot of het out there, because we're talking about statistics, and because of which statistics are easy and hard to get. We tend to be looking at Ao3 a lot when we're specifically looking at shipping, because Ao3 makes that data very obvious. I think there is a natural, probably causal relationship between metadata that, like, privileges queer stuff on, like, the same level as straight stuff, and then finding a website where people that want to write queer stuff or want to find queer stuff tend to hang out, because you can filter out het. That's very unusual in metadata design. If you look at fan fiction broadly, like all fan fiction posted everywhere, you'd have to look at Wattpad, you'd have to look at fanfiction.net and other places, and you would find somewhat different content there. Like, there's a lot more straight stuff, there's a lot more gen, there's a lot more stuff that's kind of hard to categorize in some of these spaces that don't bother with that metadata because they are kind of assumed default het, etc. So, you know, all of these kind of, like, all of this kind of subtext and all these other questions are sort of embedded in this one question that we like to ask.
And I will add, like, there's nothing wrong with writing MM, just let people write MM, it's fine. We don't need to diagnose people with why they write slash. They're allowed to just enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, I think also part of it just might be, again, to extend what Jenna said, is so many of the characters, the main characters are male, right? There are much fewer female characters. Like, when I think about sort of, you know, the original, where the term slash came from in Star Trek fandom, right? Because, you know, you look at all the characters there, and yeah, Kirk and Spock, you know, and McCoy were really focused on where were the women, right? And so if you want to have a relationship between characters you love, you kind of have to make it MM. So.
And I think we can also all attest to the fact that if you are curious about these things and you kind of do a deep dive into different fandoms, you know, if you look at, like, old Sailor Moon fan fiction from the 90s, you're going to see a lot of het and a lot of fem slash, because the relationships people care about in Sailor Moon are often between women, or maybe between, you know, the main girl and her boyfriend. you will see slash because there is some canon MM there and people were interested in it, but you're going to see a very different picture than if you're looking at like a Captain America movie.
Yeah, if you want to write about LGBT like life relationships, you can't do it on a show that doesn't pass the Bechdel test unless you want to write MM.
All right. Any other closing comments that we want to touch on before we wrap this up?
I guess I'll just say something. So obviously some of the stats projects that are represented here are fairly complex, and like you do need to know some programming or you need to know actual statistics to do them. But my experience looking at different fandom stats is that a lot of what's out there is more like the kind of thing that I do that really just requires that you be in fandom enough to kind of know what question you're asking and where to go kind of look for some data that you're going to hand categorize. So I would really encourage everybody watching this, like I did last year, to, you know, try their own hand at it. And if they're interested, you know, you're reading something, like look at that methodology, see if you think it's good. But like the barrier to entry for fandom stats is not that high if you're doing something like, hey, what ships got big in my fandom over time and like in what time frame on AO3 on fanfiction.net, whatever. Like that's a project that anybody watching this can probably do. You don't need some special knowledge to do that.
And the great thing about fandom is if you are confused about something, if you need help, all of us are on social media like all of the time. And most of us answer messages about this, I am sure, quite regularly. Like you can come and ask questions. We are not experts. I am definitely not in an ivory tower of any kind. I'm still on Tumblr. Just come and send me an ask.
Yeah, I think one of the like most incredible things I've taken away from this community is just how like kind people are. Like to cold reach outs. Like it's totally fine to just reach out to someone and say, hey, I'm interested in your work. I love what you do. And I want to learn more. No one is going to like be mean to you for doing that. You know, like people are actually like nicer in this community than you might even expect. So I would really just second what Lulu said and say, reach out to us or reach out to other people who are doing what you're interested in and connect with them. It's a great way to get started.
Echoing what everybody's saying, we are absolutely always happy to answer and do our best. So yeah, thank you so much for watching our panel. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you got something out of this and that you learned something you didn't know before. Yeah, thank you.